Well, you can see from this graph just how quickly inflation has caught up with wage growth at 2.3%. It's now at the same level as the latest data for pay growth, which covers the 3 months to January. And that's fueling concern of another cost of living crisis. Well, Frances O'Grady, General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, is in our Westminster studio, and Sarah Hewin is the Chief Economist for Europe at Standard Chartered. Sarah, I'll start with you first. I mean, how much of this increase do you think is down to the post-referendum fall in the pound now feeding into domestic price pressures?
Well, not too much so far. The main driver of higher inflation that was reported today has been rising transport costs down to higher fuel prices. If we look at how far oil prices have risen over the past year in sterling terms, they've pretty much doubled. So that's been the main driver. We're starting to see something of an impact from the weaker pound feeding through into higher import costs, but we'll probably see much more of that to come in the coming months.
What about the Bank of England's reaction to this? I mean, everyone's assuming there's going to be no increase in bank rate this year. Is that now back on the table? Is that up for discussion again?
It's certainly up for discussion, and we know that some policymakers are feeling a little bit uneasy about holding rates so low for such a long time when you're facing a sharp rise in inflation. But from the Bank of England's point of view, the higher inflation is a risk to the economy. It cuts people's spending capacity, and that could mean that growth slows, and in which case you don't want to be raising interest rates. Well,
Frances O'Grady, what do you make of what Sarah's just been saying? How worried are you about a rise in a squeeze on living standards?
I think working families up and down the country are worried about that. They're facing this double blow of rising prices and no real wage increase. And of course, the risk is that people go back to building up household debt as the only way to get by. And we know what mess that got us into last time. So we need some government action and a little less complacency from government ministers about what we see as a looming living standard crisis.
So what specifically then would you like to see the government doing, bearing in mind that, you know, the deficit is still going to be something like £51 billion this financial year and about the same next year?
That we've got working families all over the country facing a real cut in their living standards. And the root of this problem is that we've got too many insecure low-paid jobs and too little investment that will deliver the kind of high-skilled, high-paid jobs that not just families need, the country needs. Britain is still in the bottom 3 of the OECD league for total investment. That needs to change. We wanted to see that change in the last budget. Perhaps we'll get it in the next one.
Why do you think that pay settlements look like they're at risk of failing to keep up with inflation now?
I think the one prescription that the government hasn't tried is putting more bargaining power in the hands of working people. We've seen this massive growth in 0 hours and bogus self-employment where workers are too frightened to put their head above the parapet and ask for a pay rise. We've seen attacks on trade unions instead of encouraging trade unions to grow to balance up that power deficit a bit. But also, of course, we've had that pay cap on nurses, firefighters, midwives. Year after year, they've suffered real pay cuts. And, they just can't carry on that basis. I think we have a government that has promised to serve the interests of working people, and now we need some evidence of it.
So one way of restoring the playing field between the self-employed and the employed, of course, was raising national insurance contributions for the self-employed. Are you saying the Chancellor should have held his nerve last week?
I think we're very clear that the real problem here is a growth in self-employment that we would describe as bogus, where we've seen too many employers taking workers off employee contracts and putting them onto self-employed contracts, even though they're controlling their work and they're not genuinely self-employed. We would like to have seen the Chancellor deal with that. I think if you were going to reform the tax system to make it fairer between the self-employed and the employees, then you need to make sure that the self-employed get the same benefits and rights that employees get. And currently, they don't get sick pay, they don't get holiday pay, they pay for their own training. We would need to see a pretty radical overhaul of the rights that the self-employed enjoy before you hit them over the head with tax increases.
So, Sarah, where does inflation go from here? What are your expectations for the rest of the year?
We're expecting inflation to carry on rising. We think that it'll very quickly move above 3%, probably by the middle of the year. And then it's likely to stay between 2 and 3% over the next couple of years. We'll continue to see the impact of the weaker pound feeding through to higher import prices, and that impact is going to linger on.
I mean, some people would say this is actually a positive in some ways. I mean, Lord King, the governor of the Bank of England, has said that a fall in the pound, the former governor, he said a fall in the pound was inevitable. This was all essential if the economy was going to be rebalanced away from exports and away from imports and towards exports.
It certainly ought to help exports. Exports have become a lot more competitive as a result, and I think the expectations are that exports will rise. Imports are more expensive, so that ought to slow the growth in imports. It ought to help our balance of payments. The question is what's happening in the rest of the economy. We've relied on consumer spending to drive growth. As Francis says, investment has been very weak recently, and if households feel that their incomes are squeezed, either they have to borrow more, they have to draw on their savings, or they have to spend less. I think the Bank of England's concern is that households will spend less and that could end up being a problem for the economy. Worth
pointing out, Sarah, I mean, you are, lest we forget, European chief economist at Standard Chartered. I mean, we're starting to see inflation tickle higher in mainland Europe as well, aren't we?
Yes, that's right, and it's a big question for the Bank of England and for the European Central Bank. Both central banks have interest rates very low. European Central Bank is doing quantitative easing. Bank of England, up until recently, had a quantitative easing package. So for both banks, the question is, when do you start to raise interest rates? And I think both central banks are looking at what happens to wages. If wages accelerate, that'll be the signal to start to raise interest rates.
Francis, while we have you here, a quick question on unions more generally at the moment. Tom Watson yesterday suggesting that Momentum is trying to infiltrate Unite may start to fund the Momentum group. How worried are you about the consequences for the Labour Party of that?
The TUC isn't affiliated to any party, but what I am clear about is that we need an effective opposition. Any democratic country needs a good opposition holding the government to account. And my goodness me, working people out in the country really need a strong opposition fighting for them, making the case for good, skilled jobs in the parts of Britain that need them most.
Is Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party not providing an effective opposition at the moment then?
Well, I don't think it's any secret that if a party is fighting within itself, then it's not doing the job of opposition as well as many working people need it to. But let's be clear that it's not just the opposition that's got divisions. I think we've seen a fair few divisions in government too, not least over the manner of the Brexit that we have and whether this is going to be a Brexit that protects our economy, delivers good jobs, protects people's livelihoods, or whether we're going to be captured by these ultras on the backbenchers in the Conservative Party who seem to not want any kind of good deal with what is our most important trading partner, the EU.